I am the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I want to talk about Henry Bergson's book, Introduction to Metaphysics. Henry Bergson was born in 1859 in Paris to Jewish parents. He had a Polish father and an English mother. He originally trained in mathematics, but he later went on to École Normale to study philosophy. And according to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, he is one of the most famous and influential French philosopher of the late 19th to earlier 20th century, with a cult-like following. He influenced other philosophers such as Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, Levinas, and he was revived by Deleuze in Deleuze's book Bergsonism. He wrote the Introduction to Metaphysics originally in 1903, and it is considered a crucial reading guide for Bergson's philosophy. What is metaphysics? According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, it is the first causes of things and the nature of being. So Bergson's essay is inquiring into the nature of reality. Bergson says that there are two ways to know a thing. We can investigate the object externally, or we can enter into the object. For the external investigation, it means that we depend on a point of view and we rely on symbols such as language, which we then use to express ourselves about the object. While for the investigation by entering, it does not depend on point of views or symbols. Hence, knowledge that we obtain from the external investigation is relative, while knowledge that we get from the internal investigation is absolute. He gives two examples. For example, if we investigate an object in space, if you investigate it and I investigate it, we may have different findings because it depends on our different points of view. Our perceptions are different. We may also use different axes or different reference points. Hence, what our findings are require translation for the other to understand it. While if we investigate it internally, we may understand it better, but how do we enter the object? We need to insert ourselves through imagination, according to Bergson, to be in sympathy with the states of the object. For example, if we try to describe a person, an external description will be a writer looking at another person and then describing that person in so many pages. While the internal investigation is when we try to identify ourselves with that person. So we are doing putting ourselves in the shoes of another person. Bergson says that his essence cannot be perceived from without, being internal by definition, nor be expressed by symbols being incommensurable with everything else. If we remain outside, we cannot really understand. And if we use symbols such as language, it is insufficient because words cannot adequately represent the essence. For example, if we consider a feeling of a person feeling sad, but what that sadness really feels like, the word is insufficient to convey the actual feeling. We need to put ourselves in that person's shoes. So the absolute knowledge that we're seeking can only be given in intuition, according to Bergson. Bergson contrasts two concepts, one of intuition and the other of analysis. Intuition is intellectual sympathy where one places oneself within the object, while analysis is a reduction of the object to already known elements. So we are trying to express our ideas about an object as a function of something else. However, even with many points of views in the analysis, so we can take a look at this object through many different angles, it will still always be incomplete. For example, when we raise our arm, it is actually a complete movement. But if we are just taking snapshots of the position of our arm every single second while we are raising it, we are not actually capturing the complete movement. And he calls this snapshots method the cinematographic method because when we are watching TV or in the cinema, we're actually seeing multiple frames played rapidly, but this is not the actual movement. It's just snapshots being pieced together quick and displayed quickly. It is like seeing many photographs of a town versus the actual town itself. Okay, so what positive science does is analysis. And by positive science, Byung-Chul means the sciences such as physics, biology, and chemistry. The method of such sciences is a reduction to something simpler, and that's what analysis is. A reduction to something simpler. For example, understanding the human body as just a series of mechanisms, the way Descartes had understood or described the human body, and then expressing it using symbols. However, Byung-Chul claims that metaphysics is the science which claims to dispense with symbols. So how can we get inside something? So let's think of ourselves. We have a privileged point of view for our own person. Okay, we have our perceptions that we know intimately because it's imminent to us. We have memories which adhere to these past perceptions, and it helps us interpret present ones. And we have tendencies and motor habits which are bounded by these perceptions and memories. We may think of the flux within ourselves as different states, but we only think of it as different states when we reflect on them. Then we think of it that, yeah, they may be different states. But when I'm experiencing these different states, they are actually flowing into one another. For example, if I'm feeling sad and then I'm feeling very emotional, which are two different states if I think about it, these states flow into each other. They are not distinct states. Byung-Chul says that consciousness means memory. And what he means by this is that our experiences and how we perceive things, how we experience our consciousness, is like a snowball. It is accumulating more and more of the snow as it rolls down. So at the top, at the start, it may be a small ball, but at the much later time, when it's at the bottom of the hill, it's a bigger ball. He says that there are no two identical moments. Because how physics, for example, will interpret a person falling down at the exact same spot to be the same thing. You know, when he fell down today and when he fell down 5 days ago, they are the same. However, if we think about our phenomenological experience of falling, our second fall contains the memories of the first fall. So maybe when we are falling the second time, we'll be having like anger at ourselves for like tripping over that same step, you know, we should have taken note of that step that was there. But for science, both will be the same falling, actually. He contrasts duration versus time, and this is an important concept because he uses this concept of duration continually. Okay, duration is lived time. Time is how we experience it, where our experience of lived time is affected by our accumulated memories and experiences, versus time, which is objective time, where every minute has the same length as every other minute. So pure duration, according to him, excludes juxtaposition. Juxtaposition is when you put two things next to each other and then you contrast them against each other. It excludes juxtaposition, externality, and extension. You understand better what I mean as I proceed on what pure duration is. If we carry out an action without stopping, it is actually an indivisible motion, an indivisible movement. If we divide this action by inserting a stopping point, then it actually becomes two different actions. And so it is not possible to represent duration with concepts, he claims, because no image can replace the intuition of duration. But many diverse images can, however, help us by directing consciousness to the point where we can seize the intuition. So it's not that we don't need images, we can discard representations. They can help us by helping us, our consciousness, get to this place where we can then have the intuition. So we need to change the attitude we have of our consciousness to make the effort to achieve intuition, according to Bergson. What concepts do is that they make comparisons between the objects and others resembling it, and others resembling this object. But in looking for resemblances, concepts fixates on parts. And then by stacking up these concepts, we try to reconstruct the whole object with these representations of the parts. And we are, by doing that, trying to get a faithful total representation. But this faithful total representation is still insufficient to get at what is essential and unique about the object. Because what we get is only a generalization from our abstractions. And by making the comparison between objects, we are actually deforming what the object's actual property is to fit in with our conception. So example, we see a piece of clear glass, and we want to abstract from this glass to say that it is like something that's completely transparent. So we want to use the concept of transparency to think of this piece of glass. But actually, there's no glass in the world that really is transparent. We may see what's on the other side, but it's actually not transparent like a vacuum. But we are we are deforming the actual property of the glass, which is not entirely transparent. It does, change the direction of light, for example, through its medium, through its thickness. But we're deforming the actual property of the glass to fit with our conception of transparency. He says that all other sciences, excluding the science of metaphysics, so all sciences, excluding metaphysics, works with concepts. But metaphysics is only truly itself when it goes beyond the concept. So metaphysics needs to transcend the concept. It needs to create a new kind of concept, which is supple, mobile, and fluid, so that these concepts can mold themselves to intuition. And Bergson says that we can only understand duration through intuition. And this is possible only because we have an inner absolute knowledge of the duration of the self. So starting from the privileged point of view that we have, it is when because we have a privileged point of view, that's when we know that other things also would have the flux and duration within them. Okay, he now contrasts intuition with analysis, where he talks about the science of psychology. What it does is that it breaks the self that is given by intuition, it breaks it into sensations, feelings, and ideas so that it can study all these things separately. And it substitutes for the self, the reality of the self, a series of elements. Every mental state that we have, because it belongs to a person, it reflects the whole of a personality. Because every feeling contains the past and the present of the person experiencing it. So for example, my experience of an injection today is very different from the experience of the very, very first injection I ever had in my life as a child or as a baby. It's because I know already today, because of my previous experiences of injections, that an injection isn't actually like very, very painful. Well, if it's my very, very first injection I ever had, I may actually be very scared because I might feel that, I've never had this before. So, I imagine it to be very, very painful. So my experience of an injection today is different from my experience of an injection as a child. So it is because it is shaped by my previous experiences. So by my past experiences of injections, it shapes my experience of injections today. So these feelings that I have can be abstracted and analyzed, which is what psychology does. It is actually required for science to do this abstraction and analysis. But this abstraction, we need to realize that it needs to neglect the uniqueness of that person, because otherwise it cannot be expressed in known and common terms. It's just like the way an artist, if he's trying to portray a building, he needs to isolate that building from the neighborhood of buildings. He needs to focus on an element. Let's say he wants to paint just a tower of Notre Dame, was the example that Bergson gives because he's French. The psychologist needs to substitute for the entirety of a person an external and schematic representation. So he's only presenting this person through a specific point of view. A person who has visited Paris, he may put together his sketches. He may have many, many different sketches of the city, and he puts them together as a unity because of his intuition of the city. And for him, that tells him about Paris. But for a person who does not know Paris, even if he has an infinite number of really accurate sketches of the city, and they are all entitled with the word Paris, it still cannot give him the intuition because he has never had the intuition, the originary intuition. Bergson explains why. He says this is because we are not dealing here with real parts, but with mere notes of the total impression. So it's not as if we have actually the actual Eiffel Tower and the actual Arc de Triomphe and the actual Notre Dame, and then we are putting them, almost reconstructing a real city. But what we have is just representations, just notes, just diagrams, and that is insufficient. It's like trying to take a picture of a person and thinking that is the actual person. It only captures a point of view. He says that it would be like looking at a poem and then looking at each letter of the poem, so not complete words of the poem, but actually just the individual letters, and expecting these individual letters to convey the meaning of the poem. So Bergson is saying by all these examples is that going from intuition to representations is possible. So we visit Paris and then we do make representations of Paris. We can do that. It is possible. But to go from these representations, these pictures of Paris, to the actual experience of going to Paris, it is not possible. This is because the representations, the pictures that I have, they are not fragments or parts of the actual Paris. So a picture of the Eiffel Tower is not the Eiffel Tower, but it is only fragments of the symbols of the thing. And there are some things that this is the mistake that philosophers, like who are empiricists and rationalists, that they make, that they mistake partial notations for the real parts. Hence, Bergson says that through analysis, we cannot find intuition. Analysis, in fact, is the very negation of intuition. It'd be like trying to seek the original in a translation, and then when the original is not found in the translation, we say that there is no original. And Bergson thinks this is what science does. It takes the original and indistinct intuition of an object as its material. Then it multiplies its observations of it from an outside point of view. It puts together these observations then, perhaps captured in diagrams, together to reconstitute the object. But once again, it is like mistaking a painting of a person for the actual person. So long as we understand this, science is useful, that what we have are representations and not the actuality. But if we think that just because we can piece together pictures and get the actual person, then we will be mistaken. He thinks that there is a possibility of a true empiricism who really wants to get at the thing in itself. And to do that, it needs a new concept, an original concept for every object instead of its current reductionistic approach. But this then wouldn't be really a concept because it only applies to like one single thing. However, he thinks that this is actually the job of philosophy, to search for this unique intuition, which we can then descend to different concepts. So we need to reverse the usual of the intellect, since thinking usually goes from concepts to things and not from things to concepts. For example, most of us would not have seen an actual human heart, as in a real, with our bare eyes, an actual human heart. But we do have a conception of what this human heart is. So we're actually going from the concept and thinking this image that we have of the human heart to be what the human heart is really, really like. With the picture of his ventricles, or even more silly, like with the heart shape, to think that that's what a human heart looks like. But instead, we should actually see the human heart if we want to understand what a human heart really is. So to know a thing is, however, to take ready-made concepts. So for example, the shape of the pictures of the human heart, we have a ready-made concept, and to mix them together to get a practical equivalent of reality. And we do that because the work of the intellect is actually not just something completely neutral and disinterested and is completely knowledge-seeking for its own sake of knowledge. It wants to find knowledge. But in fact, the intellect is pragmatic. It tries to know things because it wants to make profits from them. It wants to know it for practical purposes. So in daily life, we juxtapose and use concepts. But then at least we must know that we are doing this for practical purposes. But this is not what philosophy is doing. This is not philosophy then. because philosophy actually aims to know the thing in itself. He now contrasts objective time or instantaneity and duration. So analysis using its concepts and diagrams, it actually takes a static view of reality. So it's a snapshot, right? It actually takes a static view versus the reality of which is in flux. So once I study a phenomenon, I suppose that it remains constant. So if there's any change, I break it down further until I get an unchanging view. So we're going to talk about Zeno's arrow, the paradox of the arrow, where a person shooting an arrow, and then if you take like a stop motion, like in a stop motion film, just a time lapse of this motion of the arrow at 0.1 seconds, 0.2 seconds, and so on and so on, it seems as if it's motionless. And then we take that moment, that snapshot, and then we take it that it's actually stationary at that point. That's Zeno's paradox. He's saying that at each point, each snapshot, the arrow is actually stationary. Jackson says that, however, there's no state of mind, however simple, which does not change every moment. Since there is no consciousness without memory and no continuation of a state without the addition to the present feeling of the memory of past moments. Okay, so this is what he means by duration, right? Where the past is prolonged into the present. Where the image of the past keeps growing, we are gaining baggage. It's like the snowball rolling out here as we get older. We are accumulating memories and experiences, which then shape our current experience. And we need to realize that our beings are not static. It's not something preformed. So me as a person, I'm not a static person who can be just defined by, my weight is 70 kg, as if it's going to be 70 kg forever. We are in fact becoming. So we are not just something static, we are continually becoming, and that is in fact the reality. So back to the Zeno's paradox of shooting an arrow, he actually solves the paradox, because what the paradox is saying is that the arrow would never ever hit the target. Because at each moment the arrow is actually stationary, and these stationary moments will never add up to an actual movement to some other thing, to some other place. The position of the moving body are not parts of the movement. There are so many snapshots of it. Okay, so this is what he's saying about Zeno's arrow flying, right? These positions that we take, these snapshots that we take, they're not parts of actually the movement. They're just snapshots. They only suppose stopping places. The moving body is never really in any of these points. It merely passes through them. Okay, so this is what Zeno is disregarding. This passage, which is movement, has nothing in common with stoppage, which is immobility. So Zeno is saying that this arrow is stopping at all these points, but in fact that is not what's happening, because in fact the arrow is just passing through these points. It's not stopping. If we say that it's stopping, this immobility, we're actually contradicting what we're trying to analyze, which is the movement. Which is why we end up with Zeno's paradox, because how can we ever reach the destination if it's just a bunch of stops? So movement and immobility, they cannot coincide since they contradict each other actually. These positions are just points of view. These snapshots are points of view. And we already talked about how, regardless of how many points of views we have, we can never construct the real. Change is analyzed by science and by Zeno as so many stable views. But in fact, what we have is an instability of the real. Even with the infinite number of points, we still need to add something mysterious there, which is this passage. Then we are not clarifying the concept. We're actually getting a very confused concept. So the problem with Zeno's paradox, the problem with this kind of analysis is that we try to use immobility to express mobility. But instead, it is movement that we need to accustom ourselves to look upon as simplest and clearest. We use immobility because we think that's clear. If you just have snapshots, we think, we analyze that will be clear. But in fact, we need to analyze the movement in its actuality. Okay, we need to accustom ourselves to analyzing the movement that way, and to think that in fact that is the simplest and clearest way to analyze a movement. Gaston asks us, how can we ever manufacture reality by manipulating symbols? Okay, so the symbols of our mathematics, of our language, by manipulating them, how can we get to reality? But he says that these symbols are habits of our thought process because we are thinking for practical purposes. We're not once again thinking for the sake of knowledge itself. We're trying to do something with this thinking. And so this imitation of the reality, this is much more useful in life than the intuition of the thing itself would be. He says, our mind has an irresistible tendency to consider the idea that is clear, the idea clearest, which is most useful. So we think that what is a useful idea is therefore the clear idea. But that is, in fact, not, once again, the reality. So what we need to do, according to Bergson, is to make this laborious and even painful effort to remount the natural slope of the work of thought in order to place oneself directly by a kind of intellectual expansion within the thing studied. So we need to go from passage, to take this passage from reality to concepts, and not from concepts to reality. Bergson foresees an objection though. If metaphysics needs to proceed by intuition, and intuition is based on the mobility of duration, and duration is something that is in our minds, it's something psychical, then wouldn't the philosopher only be able to contemplate himself and nothing else? Wouldn't we only, if duration is something that's just in our heads, it's something that's part of our experience, then aren't we only able to contemplate ourselves? He replies to his own objection by saying that intuition about duration, far from leaving us suspended in the void as pure analysis would do, brings us into contact with a whole continuity of duration in the transcendence of ourselves. So because we have an intuition of our own duration, we can also know that other things have also this duration. And so we are in contact with other durations of other beings. So now we're going to have a summary of Bergson's metaphysics, and he calls this his principles. And this is in the ending bits of the book, the ending pages of the book is where these principles are enumerated. He says that there is a reality that is external and yet is given immediately to the mind. So there is an external reality, and we don't have to go through a medium, through an intermediary to understand it. Okay, we are in direct contact with it. That's what the immediacy means. He says that this reality is mobility rather than immobility. So by mobility, he means change, progress, movement, so that things are not complete already in themselves, but they are still in the making. Things are all in the making. Rest is only apparent. Because we know our own consciousness is in flux, we can from there know that other realities are also in flux. It's just that we know we have duration, other things also have duration. Our mind, which seeks for solid points of support, has for its main function in the ordinary course of life that of representing states and things. So we are seeking this solidity, these solid points of support so that we can understand things, right? So we represent things. Because our aims of our mind is ultimately to make something useful, is utility. But because our minds are directed towards utility, we lose the essence of the thing in itself. We lose touch with what reality actually is. He says that the inherent difficulties of metaphysics are largely the results of our applying to the disinterested knowledge of the real processes which we generally employ for practical ends. We already said about this. This is utility. Our minds are directed towards being useful, right? Having useful concepts. But he said that we can only extract concepts from our thoughts from mobile reality, but we cannot go from concepts to reality. So from reality to concepts, we can do that, but we cannot go from concepts and then try to think that we have constructed reality. By persisting to go from concepts to reality, that's dogmatism, and that's also where skepticism, idealism, and critical doctrines arise. We can use our intelligence to get to intuition through intelligent sympathy. So intelligent sympathy is this definition of what intuition is. But the mind has to do violence to itself to invert the direction of our normal operations. We normally go from concepts to reality. We need to invert this, so we need to do violence to our minds. Such intuitive thinking, we will lose something. We will lose utility and precision, but we will gain range and extension. In fact, the logical apparatus of science, it comes from metaphysical intuitions. But once we have devised this method of logic, we forget about it. Bergson sees that science and metaphysics therefore can come together in intuition. This is his hope, to get a truly intuitive philosophy, to realize the much desired union of science and metaphysics. It's his hope that intuition will be the thing that would connect these two, science and metaphysics. He talks about how Galileo, when rolling the ball down a slope, he wants to study the motion itself. While Aristotle only has static concepts of like high, low, immobilities, they're fixed positions to explain the mobility of the ball rolling. But since it is human nature for us to care more for the outcomes than the process, it is human nature. But if we want to do philosophy, then we need to transcend this nature, this human nature. The focus of science is on concepts of relations. So when we draw laws, these are making relations between things, like Newtonian mechanics. So we have a scientific symbolism. Metaphysics is focused on things, the concepts of things, resulting in metaphysical symbolism. However, science may need these symbols for analytical development, but metaphysics, the aim is to do away with these symbols. So Bergson criticizes Kant's approach, which is this creation of a universal mathematic in the Critique of Pure Reason. So Kant shows that our science is relative and our metaphysics is artificial. He interprets Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Bergson interprets Kant's Critique of Pure Reason to be the foundation of a universal mathematic to get these relations and laws, but that is a move away from reality. Kant determines what the intellect must be and what the object must be like, so that his mathematics can work and can bind the intellect and the object together. So Kant is using is saying that it is our understanding that organizes nature, which then makes nature something relative to us. And this makes metaphysics impossible, because then we can never get to the thing in itself. If all we can get is our understanding, all we can get is our understanding, we can never get to the actual nature. All we have is what he calls phenomena and not the noumena. So we are only pouring all possible experience into pre-existing modes of our understanding. But Bergson is saying that the act that starts the analysis, and in fact is hidden behind the analysis, comes from a different faculty from the analytical faculty, and this is the faculty of our intuition. He gives a metaphor of writers who study their subjects very thoroughly. They write many notes, they prepare materials, okay, but they still need something more to actually create that book that they're writing. They still need something else. It's not just their notes. They need something more. What is that something more? Is to place themselves into the heart of the subject, to seek as deeply and possible an impulse after we need only let ourselves go, he says. So they need to put themselves into the shoes of the subject. But they cannot seize this impulse, because it is not a thing to be seized. This putting themselves into the heart is not something they can seize, but it's only a direction they can go. It's a direction of a movement. So how does this metaphor work? What's he trying to really say? These materials and notes that he's talking about of the writer are observations and experiences that we gather through science. He's not trying to say we don't need science. He says that we do not obtain an intuition from reality unless we have won its confidence by a long fellowship with its superficial manifestations. So we do need to go through this science then to finally get at intuition, because we need to acclimatize ourselves, basically. However, we need to understand that metaphysics is not a generalization of facts. So it is not what science is doing, it's not a project of science, but instead it is integral experience. Thank you.